It's time for the second half of our big dive into Atari's vault. This time we're going into the Atari Games period. Naturally, this period is a lot longer than the original rapid-fire spurt of the Atari Inc. era, lasting from 1984 all the way to 2000, but in the end we've got a similar amount of unreleased titles kicking about here, both ones that we can play, and ones that still remain undumped after all these years. And again, there's a lot of cool stuff kicking about. We've got a failed attempt at revisiting a couple of early classics, a licensed game featuring two of the 90s most iconic if also dumbest characters, a lost digitised cringe fest that's right on the same level as Pit Fighter, a sequel to a game that actually did really well but never ended up getting out. There's plenty to cover as we make our way through Atari's arcade timeline, so let's get on with it. We're starting in 1984, virtually straight after the original Atari broke up. The coin-op division was retained by Atari's parent company, Warner, who started a new company with Namco to manage it, but the staff in the division largely remained unchanged, and a lot of the folks we introduced in the first video, the likes of Ed Logg, Dave Tua, Mike Halley, Mark Cerny and so many others, are all still around. In short, the coin-op division was pretty close to business as usual, certainly when compared with the other parts of old Atari that had been sold off. With that sorted, let's look at the games. We start with a game you likely know. Here's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, a great 1985 game where you save the kids, whip the fuggies, get in the cart, walk from here to Mola Ram's temple, and grab those Sankara stones. Fabulous title, but this wasn't the original plan for the game. Indeed, the start of this video dovetails nicely with the end of the previous one, as we're seeing a couple of proposed 3D and Laserdisc games. Atari weren't told a lot about the plot of Temple of Doom when they started work on the game, but they knew that it was going to have a big minecart chase, and so they initially wanted to make a Laserdisc game based around said minecart chase, riding through the caves and so on. According to director Peter Lipson when interviewed for Retro Gamer, it was very much in the Dragon's Lair vein. And alas, it would have cost the earth. When things were budgeted out with the costs of not just shooting it, but constructing an elaborate set to shoot the game in and whatnot, it was estimated that the game would cost over $100 million to make. They'd have needed 40 minutes of footage to make the thing, as opposed to the 3 minutes that the film crew needed to make the scene. Perhaps it was a great idea, but it obviously wasn't a feasible one. So Lipson went back to the drawing board, and that's how we ended up with this game which, let's face it, is obviously for the best. It should be noted that there was a precursor to this, something I didn't mention in the previous video. Playland, an unreleased Laserdisc game worked on by special effects guru Richard Taylor, is a rail shooter that would have been made using miniaturised, funfair-themed sets. Again, this one never happened, although some people have noted similarities between this title and the much later Carnival. Malibu Grand Prix is a game where there were two separate attempts at making something. The idea here, according to Jed Margolin, was to make something based on the Malibu Grand Prix go-karting centres that were owned by Warner Communications, and initially it was a first-person vector game. It went fine at first, but the project went pear-shaped when sprint-esque driving controls were added to it. The controls didn't work at all in first person, and the game was cancelled. Later on, an attempt was made to make a Laserdisc game based around Malibu Grand Prix. A cabinet was actually designed for this, available on the Arcade Bloggers website, and there are about 20 minutes of footage out there made for the game, shot at a centre in Redwood City. There's even some little behind-the-scenes tidbits included. As was often the case, the short-lived nature of the Laserdisc boom, and the unreliability of the format, spelt the end for this project. Air Race is another attempt at an early 3D title. This one's on the same hardware as the cancelled Last Starfighter, and was worked on by several people who would later go on to build the hardware that powered Hard Drivin and Stunrunner, including Rick Moncrief and Jim Morris. We have a pretty early prototype to look at. It's a bit more playable than the Last Starfighter one, although it's obviously not yet at the stage where it's any kind of game, and there's no sound. It doesn't seem that the game got too far. It ran on some pretty serious custom hardware for the time, and in the end it was deemed to be too expensive. However, quite a bit of the work that went into this project would then become the basis for hard driving, including a polygon editor programmed by Jim Morris and a world editor by Max Bahansky. A lot of the detail here comes from a retro gamer making of hard driving article by Rory Milne, and considering that hard driving didn't come out until 1989, something like this little project shows just how long that game took to make. I briefly mentioned the isometric game based on Gremlins in the first video, the one that initially started out life as a game based on ET. Now would be a good time to have a closer look at it. This project was taken on by Franz Lanzinger, designer of the almighty Crystal Castles, and it would have been a System 2 game. You play as Billy, and from the looks of things there's several different types of level, parts where you're walking around and shining a flashlight on the pesky creatures, another part where Gizmo's driving a toy car, and so on. When you include the efforts to make the ET game, this whole project goes back to 1983. But after 2 years of work, the whole thing was eventually cancelled in 1985 after it was put in front of a focus group. After this, it was deemed that the Gremlins property and the game itself were not strong enough to warrant the time and resources necessary to complete it. A shame, really. From the gameplay footage out there, it looks like it may well have been entertaining, and there's just not enough available code kicking around right now, so it's not going to be available on MAME anytime soon, I would imagine. Normally when I call something a rhythm game, it's a form of innuendo. However, this next game actually is one, and it's Jammin. This dates from around 1985-1986. While we do have some footage of the game available thanks to AtariGames.com, as if you could forget where it's from with that watermark, very little is actually known about the game. The gameplay itself seems to be pretty self-explanatory. It's basically Simon, only with a musical theme, matching the drum hits with the button pressers and building a drum track for the rest of the music which also appeared in the Sprint games. It seems as though Jammin did go out on a location jaunt, most likely to a local arcade in Sunnyvale, but obviously it didn't make it. Presumably the game is still in the hands of a private collector, although again this is only going by a video of it that's probably about 20 years old. A mysterious title indeed. Accelerator is another game for which not a whole lot is known, although you may possibly be able to play it if you're ever at the California Extreme Expo. It has been there, along with a few titles that were mentioned in the first vid. Gameplay footage is available, and it's an odd-looking title. Made by Dennis Harper and Rusty Door, this is a side-on futuristic racing game of sorts, controlled with a spinner that moves the vehicle on a big tube. There's various special pads on the tube that you'll either want to touch or avoid, along with enemies called sluggos that should also be avoided, shot or sliced, and the screen's divided in half. It's certainly a game meant for 2 players. It looks a bit like a cousin of Stunrunner, only obviously not in 3D, although the first game it actually reminds me of is Uniracers, or Unirally, which came out for the SNES a good few years later. This game didn't make it because, altogether now, it didn't test very well out in the field. It's nice when we've got an unreleased game that we can actually play on MAME, and here's one of those, Guts and Glory from 1989. This is one of the best unreleased Atari games, and it's certainly one with a high pedigree considering that both Ed Logg and Dave Tura worked on programming it, so basically an Atari arcade dream team. More pedigree comes from the game essentially being an updated version of one of the company's best known titles, 1977's Combat, the game that was packed in with 2600s for years. It's made for 2 players to compete with each other, shooting down as many enemies as possible in various different modes. There's anti-aircraft, depth charge, submarine, bombing, machine gun, as well as a ground assault mode that wasn't yet playable at the time of this particular version. You blast everything in sight, try not to get killed yourself, and meet the quota within the time limit. Simple stuff, but executed very well, and it's a shame that it never came out. I expect that it didn't make it due to the usual reason, although there's no concrete info available here. Maybe the arcade goers just weren't that keen on this new take on old concepts in 1989, considering other games that were available. I mean, admittedly you probably wouldn't go for the shooting in this game over the likes of Operation Wolf, for example. But it's a cool collection of old school combat games nonetheless. in the early 1980s, the almighty Battlezone was spotted by the US Army, who convinced Atari to do a version of the game that acted as a trainer for their Bradley fighting vehicles, much to the distress of Ed Rotberg, who was dead against such a project. Years later, a similar thing happened with another groundbreaking 3D title, although it's not the Army this time. Here it's the police. Here we have the AGC Mobile Operations Simulator, or AMOS, from around 1990. This sim isn't dumped, but we can see it here in a promotional video, and it's a version of hard driving, or perhaps more accurately race driving, that's designed to simulate driving a cop car around a city, complete with a panoramic cabinet. The panoramic cab was also used commercially for special versions of race driving, although that only has 3 monitors. This police trainer has 5 of the fins. There's more here than just driving as well. It links up to monitors that review performance, and even a Laserdisc shooting game. Pretty serious hardware, and it all makes for something that's very different to the original racing title. This isn't unreleased as such, and it was available for years, but of course it was only available to cop shops, and never commercially. I thought I should mention it.
Into dangerous emergency response driving situations, where they are required to make split-second decisions. There is no other way to safely train officers in these dangerous situations, and as a consequence...
We're staying in 3D land for the next title, another one that we can't play, BMX Heat. Early on, this game was also known as Cyclotron, and it's a 3D racing game using the hard driving hardware and, of course, bikes instead of cars. A couple of pics of a prototype cabinet do exist, but we don't have anything in the way of screenshots. As can be seen, you would have controlled the game by sitting on a bike, pedalling and moving the handlebars. There's an AtariGames.com video out there too, from very early on, but unfortunately that's about all we've got for this title. Next, we have one of the most famous unreleased Atari games of them all. From 1991, here's the sequel to Marble Madness. Marble Madness 2, also known as Marble Man, came 7 years after the release of Mark Cerny's classic, and the primary goal was to fix the main issue people had with that original. It's great, but there's only 6 short levels. The sequel does add plenty more. There are now 17 levels, a bunch of power-ups, and now as many as 3 players can roll their balls about on the cabinet at once. This is good, but unfortunately the changes didn't stop here. The game was made a lot more cartoony as opposed to the abstract original. Not only does the ball have a face, but there are also cutscenes in which he changes to a humanoid and spouts cheesy one-liners. Focus groups utterly hated this, and the cutscenes were scrapped in later revisions. They also hated the controls. Marble Man did away with the trackball, opting for a joystick and accelerator button. In a 2020 interview with Antstream, designer Bob Flanagan said he thought that more people were now used to controlling console versions of the game in this manner, and that's why the change was made. But again, focus groups and particularly seasoned players of the original disliked the change immensely, preferring the original trackball. A lot of these changes were in service of making the game appeal to a more younger audience, but eventually the game was a victim to sea changes in the arcade world. With fighting games now ruling the roost, Atari thought it best to concentrate their time on Guardians of the Hood, and Marble Madness 2 was scrapped. For years the game was talked about with the hope that it would eventually see a wider audience, that those dreaded collectors would put it out there despite the old agreements they'd made with old Atari to not release the ROMs, or the prices they were rumoured to be floating around to do it, even if most everyone knew it wasn't that good. For a long time it was only playable in a couple of locations, such as the California Extreme Expo, home of several other unreleased Atari arcades. And then, on May 21st, 2022, well, it just showed up. Someone named Dank2079 dumped the ROM and uploaded it onto the Internet Archive, and not long after that it was playable on MAME. So now everyone can play it and have their curiosity satisfied, even if the end results are kind of disappointing. From around 1987 onwards, Atari made the odd attempt at revisiting some of their older classics. Blasteroids is one example, being a decent if hardly superior sequel to Asteroids, and Vindicators is another. In many ways that's a follow-up to Battlezone, with similar controls. Here in 1992 we have something more direct. Arcade Classics, a cabinet which consists of not one but two sequels that would have commemorated the 20th anniversary of the company's formation. We've got Super Centipede and Missile Command 2, the latter being very different to the original, also unreleased Missile Command 2 from 1981. Now, I say sequels, the gameplay isn't much different to the originals, but the graphics are enhanced. Technically, anyway. As much as the gameplay's still there, the graphics certainly don't have the timeless appearance of the original classics. They just look like games from 1992. There is a more new stuff dip switch that you can flick, although that only adds a couple of extra enemy ships to Missile Command 2. Centipede is frankly diminished by having a generic grass texture spread all over it, and while Missile Command 2 fares better, retaining the Earth setting, although it names the cities this time, something that Dave Tua originally decided against doing, is hardly going to replace the original. Mind you, there's no shame in that. It does at least keep the big "The End" screen. While this arcade version didn't make it, Arcade Classics games would eventually come out in the home in 1996 for Mega Drive, SNES and the like, where Ultrapon would also be added to the mix. I must say, this arcade game is, at the very least, a hell of a lot better than those ghastly console titles. When it comes to cheesy digitised Atari arcade games, well, you likely already know Pit Fighter, of course. That would be the first game that springs to mind. And you probably know Guardians of the Hood, the super corny 1992 beat-em-up. There's a lot of cringe here too. But there's a third game in this vein that you may not know at all. Say hello to Danger Express. You play as two bandanaed up badasses, and you have to stop the evil Dr. Ernst Blowfish from carrying out his evil nuke-based plan for world domination, and it's every bit as cheesy as it sounds. The actual game is kind of a hybrid between beat 'em up and shoot 'em up where you travel into the screen. It's probably best described as a really bad version of Konami's G.I. Joe, although there's a lot more close-up action here, along with plenty of cheesy voices and hilarious digitised costumes. There's not much good to say. The controls are stripped down from the likes of Pit Fighter and Guardians, so there's not a lot of variety, although the game certainly needs more work. But of course, as with many others, it did go out on a location test, and then shortly after, it disappeared never to be seen or spoken of again. Danger Express certainly does fit handsomely into the so bad it's funny category though, and I would recommend giving it a look just to, well, experience it, and be amused for 10 minutes. Crap though it may be. Dr. Sparkz Lab is a slightly crude but actually quite entertaining little puzzle game from the ever-dependable duo of Kelly Turner and Norm Avalar, where you have a monster to reanimate with the power of electricity. The gameplay is kind of a cross between Pipe Dream and Tetris. You connect the pipes from the red side to the blue side of the well, but they don't have to be in a straight line and you get more points for bigger circuits. You can also use special arrow blocks to blow up loose connections, although you do want to be a little careful that you don't blow up the whole circuit that you're working on. This is quite a likeable little puzzler that once again didn't succeed in the location testing, apparently because players found the concept too difficult to get their heads around. It's kind of a shame really, as I would definitely recommend this one. According to the late Kelly Turner, only 2 or 3 PCBs of this game even exist, so we're probably quite lucky to have the game available for us on MAME. We move to 1993, and here's another weird little game. Beathead. This game is best described as a competitive take on Q*bert, where you have to land on the tiles that match your colour and stop the other guy from doing the same, and the presentation is early 90s as all hell. It's meant to look like some sort of hip music video or visualisation, with appropriate tunage in the background. The idea itself is very cool, although it still needs a lot of work in this prototype. Generally it's just a bit too easy, and it repeats itself before too long. Again, the field tests didn't work out. Michael Albor worked as a programmer on it and thought it should have been produced, but Atari's reticence killed it. In a 2021 LifeWire interview, he said that one of the issues with Atari at the time was that they often wouldn't release something to the floor unless they thought it was an absolute surefire thing, a guaranteed hit, and this put paid to a lot of the weirder titles like Beathead. It has been said of a few unreleased Atari games, even ones like Dr. Sparkz Lab, that Atari didn't release them because they didn't think they could compete with Street Fighter II. Seems silly, but there you go. The company was simply very cagey around this time. Here's another game you likely know. Area 51, an actually pretty good light gun shooter, one that I particularly enjoyed playing back when it was kicking around in the mid-90s. The game started out life as something different though. Originally it was called Bounty Hunter. There's a big article on the Arcade Heroes website about this game with info from one of the artists, Scott Christian Sava. Essentially, Atari wanted their own gun game to compete with the likes of Lethal Enforcers, and Bounty Hunter would have had you chasing down various criminals. There'd have been a robot that had gone rogue, a witch doctor, an evil tycoon and other assorted villains, and there was some filming and capture done for these characters. The game was worked on for around about a year in this form before Sava moved on, but a lot of the elements that went into the creation of Bounty Hunter would end up forming the basis for 1995's Area 51, a monster smash of a title that is, in fact, Atari's biggest arcade game of the decade. I said a couple of entries ago that a lot of Atari games were cancelled because the bosses didn't think they could compete with Street Fighter II, and here's a more direct attempt at trying to take on Capcom. Cyberstorm, a cancelled fighting game from 1993, is a pretty ban-average affair in which several robots go at it. It's not as cheesy, crude and flat-out terrible as something like Time Killers is, but there's not an awful lot to shout about here and you can see why it didn't really get anywhere. This is but the first of several Atari fighting game efforts that didn't make it, and we'll be seeing a couple more. This proto is a relatively recent addition to MAME, not becoming available until the beginning of 2018. It appears that it was acquired by the MAME community through donations to the Japanese arcade collector Showtime, a name that's been mentioned several times whenever we've covered unreleased arcade titles, as he's been responsible for quite a lot of prototypes getting out there. Happily, we do have a bunch more info for the next two 3D titles, both of which are games from the Drivin series that never came out. First up, here's Street Drivin from 1993. We can actually play this title in MAME, and it's pretty much complete, it just never ended up getting out there. Street Drivin carries on with the same classic formula, but with more added on. There are now 4 tracks to choose from, the original track and Super Stunt track now joined by autocross and stock car circuits. There's 4 cars too. The original Sportster is now accompanied by a Roadster, Speedster and Police car, all with their own difficulties. From there the game is more of the same. You'll certainly dig it if you like hard and race driving, but it's not going to change your mind if you don't. Unfortunately, this didn't enter full production, and neither did another game in the series that was set for 1993, Hard Drivin's Airborne. Again, we've got different tracks and cars to play around with, and as the title suggests, you can now fly. You can gun it down those air ramps and take to the skies. It's far from perfect, but it's pretty cool. This game is also playable in MAME, but a few cabs actually were produced for Airborne, and they do look very nifty indeed. They certainly fit in with all the other cool cabinets that were made for games in the Drivin series. Still, now that we're in 1993, it's perhaps understandable why neither of these games went into full production. Unfortunately, they do look rather pedestrian when compared with contemporaries. Daytona USA and Ridge Racer both came out this year. The driving games couldn't really compete with games like those two, with their highfalutin textures and their speed and what have you, and they're not exactly cheap alternatives, especially when you consider those cabs. But they're still cool artifacts, and I'm certainly jealous of any of the lucky few who have one of those airborne machines. We've got another attempt at a 3D driving game. This one's called Metal Maniax. Unfortunately, we don't have any gameplay footage of this one in action, but apparently it's a Demolition Derby style game, and the hardware involved is absolutely monstrous. System 16 describes the board as one that features literally hundreds of chips, including 8 CPUs and DSPs. The cabinet itself is also a monster, a twin cabinet that can be linked up to another with seats that move about. It all sounds suitably bombastic, but the game itself apparently isn't that good. Despite all the serious hardware, it runs like an absolute dog, only able to produce 25 to 30 frames at best, and occasionally going down into the single digits. And so, this didn't come out. Atari felt that the game lagged too far behind the likes of Daytona USA. It's a shame that we aren't able to see any footage of the game running, although there are a few cabinets out there. Back in 1991, Atari released Road Riot 4WD, a fairly decent off-road racing title. 3 years later, there was an attempt at a sequel that didn't come off, Road Riot's Revenge Rally. This game is listed as not working in MAME, although it is sort of playable. The only trouble is that the tracks don't actually turn, and I do imagine they're supposed to. This sequel plays similarly to the first title and has the same digitised graphics, but the main addition is weapons. You can use basic shots to slow vehicles down, missiles to blow them up, and shields to protect yourself. When you combine this with all of the stunts you can do on these quick-fire courses, it makes for a wild racer, the sort where it's pretty easy to go from last to first and back again in no time at all, and it's not all that bad. But again, it just seems a bit lacking in the technical department compared to other games that are out there. It does feel like a game from a couple of years prior to 1994, and I couldn't see this competing with something like Cruising USA, in all honesty. As we get further into the 90s, we head into pretty choppy waters for Atari Games, where they're struggling to get hits and can't compete with the big boys on a technical level. While this game doesn't look terrible, it's most certainly behind the curve. Here's Fishin Frenzy, a 1995 game from Mike Halley. This one is pretty self-explanatory. You plunge your hook into the sea and try to catch as many fishies as possible, avoiding other bigger creatures along the way such as sharks, skeletons, and the dreaded sea monster. Naturally, you get more points if you get multiple fish on your hook with a single cast, and yeah, that's about it. This is quite a simple game and there's not a lot to say about it, although it's entertaining enough. It just kind of reminds me of an old screensaver more than anything else. Lord BBH says that this feels more like a Redemption SWP type game as opposed to a proper one, and I'm inclined to agree. Perhaps that would have been the case if this game had actually come out. The hardware that's run in the game is more interesting. The board for this game is called the Kojag, and it's essentially an arcade version of the Jaguar. Most of the titles made for the Kojag board didn't come out. There's one called 3-on-3 Basketball, for which we basically have nothing but a name, and another that we'll be seeing in a few entries' time. The two games that did come out on Kojag hardware were, at the least, successful ones. Area 51 and its follow-up, Maximum Force, were both released using it. Okay, here's another unreleased title that's generated a lot of interest. There could have been an arcade game based on the almighty Beavis and Butt-Head, everyone's favourite pair of immature teenage layabouts. The game would have been a collaboration between Atari and 3DO, running on 3DO based hardware, and it would have been a beat-em-up. There's more typical belt-scrolling sections, similar to what you'd see in TMNT or what have you, although there's also sections where you're going into the screen, similar to what we saw in Danger Express. Naturally, there's a load of people and settings from the show, a power-up that turns you into Cornholio. It doesn't look like a great game, but I'd sure as hell love to play it. As we enter this time period for Atari, with the company struggling more and more, there's a new reason for cancellation. When Atari Games was bought out by Midway, a whole bunch of projects were cancelled, and Beavis and Butt-Head was apparently one of them. A dozen or so cabs were sold at an MTV auction in 1999, but the game is yet to be dumped. It's usually playable at California Extreme, and there is a cabinet at Galloping Ghost, although the game itself is far from finished. A couple of levels were still yet to be done, and the game crashes often. Here's another intriguing one. Bloodlust IK3 from 1996. The title should give you a little clue here. This game was supposed to be a sequel to International Karate, or IK+, the legendary 8-bit fighting game from Archer McLean. Not exactly a faithful sequel, mind you. Judging by the screenshots that we have available, mostly taken from an Edge magazine feature that can be found on Unseen 64, this would have been a much darker and basically altogether different game with a whole bunch of weapons. Apparently it was rather similar to Killer Instinct. Also, it would have been released on PlayStation alongside the arcade, but in the end neither version came out. We don't know exactly why, but this game was in production at around the same time that Midway bought out Atari, so it's possible that this was one of several projects that were cancelled by Atari's new owners. Alien Scum is another 1996 game that we know very little about. It did get a location test, but it didn't do well, and it was apparently far from finished. This would have run on the same 3DO hardware that powered Beavis and Butt-Head, but apparently said hardware would have needed a bit of upgrading to run the title properly. From the few screenshots that exist of the game, it appears to be a B-movie themed rail shooter, but it's hard to make any judgments based on what's out there, which is honestly not very much. Another swing and a miss from Atari Games. Freeze, happily, is a game that we can play. Not a great one by any stretch, but it's something. This is a competitive puzzle game where you have to sort out various fish, putting 3 or more of the same type together, making combos that will freeze the opponent's fish and decrease the size of their well. You know the drill. It's a fine enough game for what it is. The game runs on the same Kojak hardware that powered Fishin Frenzy, and you may be curious as to why the game's in Japanese. It's because this game was very much designed with the Japanese arcade market in mind, an attempt at a pivot by Atari Games that didn't end up coming off. Once again, the Midway buyout is largely to blame here. A YouTube comment on Galloping Ghost's video for Freeze from Atari animator Nicholas Weigel, who worked on the game, basically said that the new bosses weren't interested in much except drivers, fighters and shooters, and that if you weren't making those, you were no longer welcome. And thus, Freeze got frozen out. Another pretty big hitter coming up, one of the last of them in fact. As we've previously mentioned, Atari Games generally struggled for hits as the decade wore on, but they did find a couple here and there. We've already mentioned Area 51, and 1994's Primal Rage was another smash, a digitised dinosaur fighter that also made a whole load of cash in merchandise sales, thanks to a popular action figure line from Playmates. It's surprising because you would have thought that something like Primal Rage would have been an absolute shoo-in for a sequel, but while such a thing was worked on, it never came to be. Primal Rage II was cancelled in 1996. In this sequel, you would have played as avatars, human characters that you'd be able to change into the original game's beasts, kind of similar to Bloody War, although that game came out a year later. Again, Atari just didn't feel that this sequel was going to make money after they'd tested it. And indeed, a digitised fighter like Primal Rage may well have felt like yesterday's news in 1996, when everything else including fighters were shifting to full 3D. However, the game is actually playable nowadays. Footage of it appeared on YouTube in 2012, and in 2017 it was made available in MAME, although it's only available in a build of MAME that's specifically designed to play the game, made by someone named Gruntzilla94. The code that's out there is still pretty far from completion and is prone to crashing a lot, but it is playable. A few entries ago, I mentioned that Bloodlust IK3 was supposed to be a fighting game in a pretty similar vein to Killer Instinct. I must say, I wonder if this game here, Vicious Circle, is related to that failed project, mainly because this title is a wholesale rip-off of Rare's game, right down to the characters, the pre-rendered backgrounds and the combo mechanics, and there's also fatalities thrown in for good measure. The game runs on the Kojak hardware, it's a pretty average title indeed, and what's here seems to be mostly complete, but once again it fell through. According to an article by Jimu Baka, work started on the game in 1994, it had the working title of Project Hero, and again it appears that Atari didn't think it would perform well enough to justify production. You may well want to play this if you like Killer Instinct and fancy playing a take on the game that's just that little bit worse in every respect. Meanstreak is another rather obscure game from 1998. We do have an AtariGames.com video of it, but the game's not out there. It's by Steve Ritchie, who took the lead on California Speed, and it runs on similar PC-based hardware to that which powers San Francisco Rush. However, Meanstreak features combat in the shape of guns, missiles and mines. Again, we don't know much at all beyond the ancient video that's out there. We're not even really sure when it was cancelled. It could have been before California Speed in 1997, or it could have been after. 10th Degree, also known as Juco Threat, is the last Atari prototype in this video that we can actually play. It's another fighting game and, hey, it's actually a good one. It's certainly a lot better than Vicious Circle. Hell, it's a lot better than Mace the Dark Age, and that game actually got released. This is quite different from the Western 3D fighter norm. It's got much more Japanese influence, an attempt to make a speedy fighter that's a cross between Street Fighter and Tekken, complete with appropriate meters and super combos. The guy who headed up the project, James Goddard, was the co-lead designer on Street Fighter II Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting, and creator of the cult hit Weapon Lord, so he certainly had pedigree. And while this version still does need work, it is very playable indeed. Is it a Tekken beta? Almost definitely not, but certainly worth having a go at. It's a real shame that this one didn't come out. A contemporary article from GameStop in 2000 announced that the game was cancelled due to the state of the fighting game market. Yet again, it wasn't deemed competitive enough. And here we are, the final entry. Generally speaking, the 90s were a miserable time for Atari games, but over the course of this video we've touched on most of their biggest hits on the floor. The cheesy digitised title that followed on from Pit Fighter, the origins of what would become Area 51, the cancelled sequel to Primal Rage. There's one other big hit that we've yet to really mention, and that is San Francisco Rush. Atari managed to score in 1996 with this racing game, and quite rightly so because it's damn good. They'd capitalise over the next couple of years, releasing Rush the Rock as an update featuring Alcatraz, and then a full sequel, San Francisco Rush 2049, in 1999. And this 2000 title, Hot Rod Rebels, is the sequel to that game. If this had come out, it would have been based around muscle cars and featured 8 different tracks to race on. According to Steven Reisenberger, who worked on the Rush games, there'd have also been a quarter-mile drag race before the start of each circuit. However, it wasn't to be. Work on Hot Rod Rebels stopped on June 22, 2001, along with the entire work of the Coin-Op division. Atari Games was Midway Games West at this time, and on that day Midway announced that it would be exiting the Coin-Op market. Midway West would continue as a developer of console games until February 7, 2003, when it was shuttered entirely. The old office in Milpitas was closed, and several of Atari's old luminaries, including Ed Logg, Mike Halley and Dave Shepard, were still there to turn out the lights. And with that, we finished our look at Atari's many unreleased arcade games. There's a lot of cool titles here, and there's probably many cases where you're wondering why these games didn't come out. Why didn't they take the punt? I suppose it's a case where you have to put yourselves in the shoes of the guys running the company, particularly as they struggled throughout the 90s. It takes a good chunk of money to make these arcade games, but it takes a whole load more money to produce them, to make all the cabinets and whatnot. It's that process which makes a company like Atari Games quite risk averse, especially when they don't have as much cash to play with as other companies did, and why they put so much on location testing. If a game went out on the floor in a local arcade and didn't generate interest there, well, why would that be different elsewhere? Whether that would have been true in the case of all these unreleased games is something that we'll never know, but in the majority of cases they didn't feel it was worth the risk of potentially losing a lot of money that they couldn't afford to lose. And that's the straightforward reason why most of these games never saw the light of day. Hopefully more of these unreleased titles will leak out in the future so that we can see them for ourselves, but that's always going to be a slow process. In the world of unreleased prototypes, patience is most certainly a virtue. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.